if you have an expression like 2 and 3 like this, you can of course interpret it as a division, 2 divided by 3. So if, for example, if you have 2 pizzas and want to divide them among 3 persons equally, then we can go about the following way. We give each person, the first person will get this part. Here we have divided up the pizza into thirds. And the second person will get these 2 uncolored parts. And the third person will get these. So now we see that each person will get the same amount. Both will get 2/3 of a pizza. So we see that if you have 2 pizzas dividing on 3 persons, each person will get 2/3 of a pizza. So instead of talking about this is how much each person gets, they will get this much. But we see we can interpret it as 2/3. So on the one hand we can see this as division of 2 divided by 3, but we can also see it as 2/3. So therefore you can use the same symbol for division and for fractions. So a fraction is a number. This is a number, symbol for number. So other examples are, for example, 4/5. We can also have minus 2/7. Okay, so this is how we interpret a fraction. A fraction is just an unresolved division of 2 numbers, you could say. It's a quotient, the result of a division. So we can interpret it like 2/3, but we can also interpret this like 2 out of 3, for example, or a scale 2 to 3. So we can interpret this in many different ways, but often we will do it 2/3, for example. Note that these are not a type of number. This is just a way of expressing a number. For example, if you have a half, then we could just as well write it as a decimal number. This is the same number, but here we represent it as a fraction, here we represent it as a decimal number. So this fraction is not a type of number, it's just a way of representing a number. Sometimes it's better to express it as a fraction than a decimal number, because if you have a 1/8, what is that? 0, 1, 2, 5 in a decimal. If you give a person this decimal number, they're not sure maybe that this will equal 1/8. Here it's easier to see what it represents. It's 1/8 or something. This seems a little bit more complicated if you look at it. So sometimes it's better to write it as a fraction. Here we have a finite number of decimals. In other cases we have an infinite number of decimals. For example, for 1/3 we will have infinitely many 3's. We can also write it like this. Or for example, if you have 1/13, then we will have 0.07693, and they will repeat itself infinitely many times. So you have 0.76923, and then we continue 0.76923 indefinitely. But the thing here is, if you have a fraction, if you have 2 numbers, integers here, and have a fraction, they will always give a finite number of decimals or infinitely many that will repeat itself like this. If you have infinitely many that don't repeat itself, then you can't write it as a fraction of 2 integers. Then it's called an irrational number. For example, pi. It will have decimals which will never repeat itself. So it starts 1, 4, 1, 5, but they will never have a pattern that will repeat itself. Therefore, you can't write this as a fraction of 2 integers. Sometimes in school you hear people talking about proper and improper fractions. So a proper fraction is a fraction that if you put it on a number line, it's between -1 and 1. So if you put 0 here, if you have a fraction whose value is between here, that has a value between 0 and 1, for example a half or minus a third, or minus 2/3. All these are proper fractions, but an improper fraction would be, for example, 3/2, since it's bigger than 1, or minus 5/4, since it's less than minus 1. All these improper fractions you can always write in a mixed form. For example, 3/2, you can write it as a combination of a proper fraction and an integer. This I can write as a 1 and a half. So this is a mixed form. It's an integer and a proper fraction. Or if I have 7/3, I can write it as 2 and a third. So this is called a mixed form. It's both an integer and a fraction. A fraction can be written in infinitely many different ways. For example, if you have a half, you could just as well write it as 2/4, or 3/6, or 4/8, and so on. So there are infinitely many different ways you can write a fraction. And they all have the same value. It's just a different way of writing them. So how do you know if two fractions are equal? So how do you know if two fractions are equal? Yeah, you have to make them the same denominator. This number up here is called numerator. This number is called denominator. So if you make them first the same denominator, then you can compare the numerators to see if they're equal. And you will find out that they are equal if A times D is equal to B times C. So that's a condition to have two fractions equal. So how do you add two fractions? So let's take, for example, 2/3 and add 4/3. Yeah, now it's not so difficult. If you make a figure, you see here, if you take 2/3, it's this part. And if you add 4/3, so 4/3 is this. Then you just count up how many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what you do, you just add the numerators. You have 2 from here, 2/3 from there, and 4/3 from the other one. So if you just add the numerators, it will turn out correctly. So you just count how many thirds you have. So this is 6/3 equal to 2. So you see if you move these two over there, you see that it constitutes 2 complete pizzas. So how do you add if they do not have the same denominator? Yeah, then we first have to transform them so that they have. We will come back to that. We must first have some rule for that. But before that, we will see how do you subtract. So for example, if you have 2/3 minus 1/3, then you can just reason in a similar way as this figure. You just have to count up how many you have. So you take the numerators. So you take 2 minus 1. And this works since they have the same denominator. So you can't do this if you don't have the same denominators. And you can't do this, what you did here, if you don't have the same denominator. So here is 1/3. If you want to add two fractions that don't have the same denominator, so 2/3 plus 4/5, then you first have to make the same denominator, and then you can use a rule of lengthening a fraction. So if you have a fraction like this, you can use the following rule. You can multiply up with any number if you at the same time multiply it down with the same number. So this is a rule you can use then. So in this case, so if you have 2/3, so if we multiply up and down with the same number, and what should we choose? Now we want to make these two the same. So if you multiply 5 up and down here and 3 up and down here, they will become the same. So if you multiply 5 up and down here, and for the other one, 4/5, we multiply 3 up and down. Then we see now that we have the same numbers in the denominator. So here we have 10/15, and here we have 12/15. And now we can just add the numerator since it's the same denominator. So this is 10 plus 12 divided by 15. This is 22/15. We can also use the same rule here, but in opposite direction. You just switch side of these two. We can write it like this: A times C, B times C. This is the same as A, B. So we see here that they have a rule for shortening a fraction. So if you have a common factor in the numerator and denominator, we can just get rid of it or shorten it out. So for example, if you have 4/10, we can write this as 2 times 2, and this as 5 times 2. And now we see we have the same number here and here, which corresponds to this C here. So we can just drop that or shorten it. So we will have remaining 2/5. So we see here that the 4/10 is the same as 2/5. So we can either lengthen a fraction, like we did here, multiplying up and down, or we can shorten a fraction. We can also multiply two fractions. So if you have A, B multiplied by C, D, then the rule is just to multiply the numerators and multiply the denominators. So for example, 2/3 multiplied by 4/5, then it's just 2 times 4 and 3 times 5. So it's 8/15. So that's just how you multiply two fractions. You can also divide two fractions. And then the rule is to transform it to multiplication. So if you divide, it's the same as taking multiplication, but where you flip the second fraction. So where the numerator becomes denominator and the denominator becomes numerator. So this is the rule for division of two fractions. And here now you can just use the first rule for multiplication. So you can multiply up and down. So for example, if you have 2/3 divided by 4/5, so then it's 2/3 multiplied by 5/4. So we have flipped the fraction. So this is just 2 times 5 and 3 times 4. So 10/12. But now we see here we can simplify this, since we can write it as 5 times 2, and this as 6 times 2. So we can shorten out these 2 here, and this become 5/6. We can also have done it here. Sometimes you write it like this, you shorten out that to that one, and there's 2 remaining. So you have 3 times 2, that's 6. And here it become 1. 1 times 5 is 5. So this is how you multiply and divide two fractions.